This presentation is also available for download on offmarketmentor.com. If you go to offmarketmentor.com, you will be able to download this presentation and be able to get some of the sources and stuff that I mentioned within here. So today we're going to be focusing on debt cycles and their effects on real estate historically throughout time. This is the shortened version. When I got into this, I realized that I could probably write a book on this subject. And this is expanding on the work of so many others. Ray Dalio, all of his books, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which talks about civilizations and their evolution throughout history. There's a lot of different books that I pulled from and a lot of different scholar articles that I pulled from to be able to put this together. I fact-checked everything super heavily because I don't want to miseducate or mislead anybody. I'm not drawing conclusions in this video. I'm just going over what has happened in the past, and you kind of have to draw your own conclusions. I guess you could pay me and I would tell you my conclusions, but that's for you to draw your own out of what you learn here today, and hopefully you learn something. So let's jump right into it. So this is debt cycles and their effects on real estate, the shortened version. You can find me on all social media at the Real Jake Arnold. This is a quick history of real estate over the last 2,000 years. So 2,000 years ago, Rome, we have traces of private property laws coming from Rome. We have engraved stone artifacts that show property ownership by private individuals and things like that. But still, usually the elite owned housing back in the Roman ancient empire, which is about 2,000 years ago. But that's our first traces that we have, that I've studied. It probably goes back further. I just haven't gotten past 2,000 years. So anyway, I just want to hit on this quick just so you understand the history of housing and where we've come from, basically. In the 9th to 15th century, so medieval Europe, we mostly used feudal systems for land ownership. So basically the monarchs and the elites owned all of the land, and peasants, or another word for it is like serfdoms, people would live on this land and all the agriculture production and things like that. The owner would take a piece, that was their form of taxes, that type of thing. So if you think about old shows and kingdoms and lords and stuff like that, that's a feudal system. That's exactly what I'm talking about here. We have lords, vassals, fiefs, served by peasants and serfdoms, all that type of stuff. So this carried into America and the colonization of America. A really good example of this, I'm from Pennsylvania, so a really good example is Pennsylvania. William Penn was gifted Pennsylvania by King Charles II to repay a debt that his father had owed. The king owed to his father, right? So William Penn got gifted this land, and the king was just like, here, take this. It wasn't really that big of a deal. I don't think William Penn ever really even came over here into the United States during early colonization. However, what it looked like then was like an extension of a feudal system, just a little bit more privatized. So now you have a noble basically owning land, or an elite or super wealthy owning land, and then to make money off of that land, he would sell plots to settlers. And William Penn was a Quaker, so Quakers were being persecuted at that time. So he sponsored his land by saying, we encourage religious freedoms, we encourage democracy and freedom in general. And that's how he got people to come here. And one of the earliest cities in Pennsylvania was Philadelphia, right? So William Penn and similar situations happened on all the other colonies and states where somebody owned all of the land, or the state owned all of the land, and then it was sold to settlers as they moved here, right? And then at some point there was a annual fee that you would pay to acknowledge that land ownership. So like with William Penn, you would pay a quintrent to William Penn to be able to acknowledge his ownership of the land, and that's what turned into our modern form of taxes. So we didn't really get into the privatization of land and some of the things that we have today until the start of the country. So 1776, the Declaration of Independence. Another really important document that came out at that time was The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. So Adam Smith was like the father of modern economics, basically, and he was like an elite that basically is putting out this work for everybody to read, and it really talks about the capitalist system and how beneficial that is for society and all that type of stuff. But one of the things I wanted to read in here from his book Wealth of Nations, I think it gets the point really well, is once individuals and groups began to accumulate property, they created an institution, government, for their protection against domestic and foreign encroachment. The acquisition of valuable and extensive property, therefore, necessarily requires the establishment of civil government. So that means, once you start acquiring things, you kind of want protection against somebody coming and taking your things, right? So, like, private property has this built-in feeling of security. In his book, he also talks about how private property ownership is basically the seed for innovation, and a good personal property and property ownership state or laws really help to develop innovation. I think a really good example of it is what I have here in the slide. For a society to be content, you want home ownership. Private property is essential for the development and innovation of a society. For example, you have a house now, you have land, you start building things on the land. Maybe in the day you got oxen, all that type of stuff. You had to learn how to use these tools that you were using. Now you might have a tractor or something like that, or a lawnmower. And I know a lot of people don't work on them as much now, but there are a lot of people in their garages tinkering around. And a lot of amazing companies have come from people tinkering in their garages, all that type of stuff. So these all happen once you have a home and once you have a property to be able to store things and work on things, and you have a sense of security and a sense of community, you're more apt to go and innovate and be productive. So that's what Adam Smith kind of talks about in his Wealth of Nations, and anybody that has studied this before, they kind of know that. So we'll get into it later in the slides, but this idea comes up over and over and over again. Lending practices didn't really emerge until 1350. The Dutch are the ones that first invented capital markets, and Jewish and Islamic religion, for the most part, throughout the last, before 1350, they were against lending, right? They were against charging interest because they know that the debtness it could bring in the history of human nature. Typically, humans, they are not responsible when it comes to credit expansion. So the USA and the continued innovation of capital markets have raised quality of living standards around the globe. I think our property laws and the security/innovation it produces is a major contributing factor. I think people that have studied this know this to be true. In 2023, residential real estate alone accounted for about $47 trillion in market capitalization. So that's more than all of stocks combined, right? That's more than all companies combined. If you take all the residential real estate in the United States, you get somewhere around $47 trillion, and that's bigger than everything else. So let's get into long-term debt cycles versus short-term debt cycles. This chart here, or over here, is a chart from the St. Louis Fed. It is on their website, so it's something they're very aware of, right? So short-term cycle, or the business cycle, is basically the beginning of credit expansion. So if you're an individual, if you're a company, if you're a country, it all kind of boils down to the same thing. You have a good balance sheet, you have good assets, and your, let's say, like your debt to income ratio is good. And that allows for credit expansion, right? Because you can get lending. People want to lend to you, you're in good shape. And when credit expands, you typically see a rise in productivity. So, things go up, and then there's a point where all that debt and those rising costs and things like that start to take away from your productivity. They start to eat at your cash flow, and you have to start dumping money over here to pay these debts and to pay, all the stuff you got going on, and it starts to become burdensome. So then we get into a contraction phase typically. And that usually happens all the way to the trial, and the cycle repeats. And this is typically on a 5 to 10 year window, 7 to 10 year window, give or take 2 or 3 years. And it happens over and over and over again. A long-term debt cycle is this on a longer scale, on a 100 to 75 year scale, give or take 25 to 50 years, typically. So this is like the rise and fall of a country and their world reserve currency and their empire. And a lot of this comes from Ray Dalio's work. But the Dutch, the British, they were all empires at one point that basically ran the world, and now we are, fortunately. But the Ottoman Empire, the Chinese, like there's been so many that have risen and fallen, and it's very cyclical, I would say. So commodity, I wanted to touch on this as well, commodity-based currency versus a fiat currency. And in this chart here, we can see that this is in the United States, our current interest rate costs are exceeding everything else in 2024 for a period. That exceeds our defense spending, Medicare, Medicaid, pretty much everything. So that's a real problem. At this time, we're at over $34 trillion in government debt. And when you're paying interest that exceeds all your other spending, you can see where that starts to spiral out of control pretty fast. So the United States government is currently in a very interesting situation. Not saying that we haven't experienced it before, though. Typically, when a government debts are denominated in its own currency, it can print money to service its debts. So this devalues the currency and its debt at the same time. So basically, you're printing money, you're devaluing the currency, but your debt is denominated in your currency, so you're devaluing the debt as well. And it's typically a lot less painful to do this than some of the alternatives. And usually the people start uprising in the streets when it gets too painful, right? So this causes asset prices to inflate, and most things with intrinsic value, things that you actually use, water, food, housing, those types of things to inflate, because those are the real assets. That's what you really, really need. A lot of our economy is made up of paper. So it causes asset prices to inflate, which leads to wealth gaps because the wealthy typically own assets, that type of thing. So in 1971, we totally left a commodity-backed currency system. President Nixon took us off in 1971, and that led to a bunch of different things, but I'm not going to get into that. Let's talk about real estate and the socialization of housing. So one of the things I noticed when making this study was how throughout each recession, there was typically a response by the government to try to spur economic growth, right? So if you look at both charts I have here, I'm covering up the one kind of. Let me try to see if I can. There we go. So you can see here that a lot of the recessions that we've had in response. This is just the FHA that I have. This timeline. This is the FHA. So a really good example is the Great Depression, 1929, 1933. It was bad, and people were going hungry. Like it was bad. Coming out of 1933, we have the invention of the FHA, 1934. So that's the start of the FHA, and I just put up this timeline to show that the FHA has obviously evolved and created more programs and agencies to achieve its mission of homeownership for individuals in the United States, which Adam Smith talks about as a very important thing. This isn't all of the acts, and there's been a ton of different acts that pass typically, but credit expansion creates major wealth gaps, and when those wealth gaps get too extreme, we see more effort in to redistribute that wealth, right? And some of these programs help redistribute that wealth. Housing has a major impact on our economy, as I said before. The market capitalization of real estate is massive, and the government incentivized real estate investors based on housing needs throughout history. So this is more of a continued, some of the acts and some of the things that we've done in response to economic downturns or just in response to how the population was feeling at that time. This isn't all of them. There's been tax reforms, there's been a lot of different things that change and morph into different things, and they usually have major effects on housing. So let's get into the United States housing market over the last 100 years. We're going to start with the 1900 to 1960 era. So coming into the 1900s, we saw massive immigration to Ellis Island, big price increases, and urbanization. So when you have a bunch of people moving into an area, you typically see urbanization. You start to see segregation as the people that are new to the country are typically poorer than the people that have been there, so they move into less desirable areas, and this creates segregation, unfortunately. So we saw a lot of that leading up to World War I and before, the beginning of the Ellis Island immigration. And then there was a panic in 1907. I don't really have this on here. I don't want to get too far into it. This is only supposed to be 15 minutes, and I'm already at 16. So World War I, the USA saw major expansion and profits by supplying weapons to allies. So we weren't directly involved into the war until the last year, and the United States actually profited a lot from World War I. We sold weapons to everybody, and there was massive wartime production going on in the United States. People were moving to cities to be closer to jobs, to be able to get in on that wartime production. And there was actually a government housing corporation created to build housing so that people could be closer to arsenals and shipyards. So the United States Housing Corporation was a federal agency that existed during World War I. Its purpose was to provide housing for wartime production workers near arsenals and shipyards, which led to the Roaring Twenties. So a lot of people know about the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties was a great time in United States history. It was our industrialization revolution, a lot of people say. Railroads, automobiles were on the rise, and easy credit was on the rise. So you could get loans, you could get credit pretty easily in the 20s. And there was also an expansion into the suburbs. So with the rise of the automobile, anytime we see technological innovation, we typically see credit expansion and things like that, as well as some other consequences, maybe not all good. But some of this immigration and migration really led to a boom in housing, where we started building out suburbs. We were working on revitalizing our urbanization efforts, all that type of stuff. And the government wasn't as involved at this time. And the Roaring Twenties is what led to the Great Depression. So we had a credit expansion, and then we had the Great Depression. So 1929 to 1933, I have in here, 1932, 273,000 people lost their homes. Remember, the population was a lot lower back then. And the next year, 1,000 mortgages a day were being foreclosed. In 1933, 40 to 50% of all mortgages were in default. 30 to 34, housing prices fell about 33%. So housing prices during this time fell in, it fell the most in places that had the most growth, right? And as a result, coming out of the Great Depression, I just noted here that we had the 1934 FHA program and the 1937 Housing Act. So 1934 was also our first step off the gold standard. It was illegal to own gold for a period of time. So up until this time, we were on a gold standard, and we started to step away from it starting now, and because of massive deficits that we were experiencing at this time. So post World War II, so going into through the 30s, it was like a recovery era, and it led us into World War II. Basically, countries all around the globe were experiencing financial difficulties, especially Germany after World War I. They had hyperinflation. You should read up on that. Anyway, so post-World War II boom, 1940 to 1960. The war ends in 1945. So World War II brought rent control, but not sales price controls. So I believe 80%, I think it's in here, 80% of the 1940 rental housing stock lay in areas that the federal government put under rent control between 1941 and 1946. And that's from a Cambridge study. This led to slums that we later tried to revitalize in, through the 1949 to 1960s periods. However, during this wartime, there was massive rent controls imposed on everybody. Housing wasn't being built because people were focused on the war effort. All your labor was either building war items or fighting in the war. So no housing being built. They had to enact rent controls because, I'm not going to assume why, but there's a bunch of different things that happened that might have triggered rent controls. Sales price was not controlled, so you could sell a property and still make top dollar for it, but you could not rent a property for whatever you wanted during this time. So there was also urbanization during this period, so people were moving to the city to get those jobs, to get part of that wartime production. And so coming out of World War II is when we see the rise of the VA loan. And that's, so the FHA basically creates the VA loan. And we start to see that coming out of World War II when everybody starts getting home. So the 1960s to the 1980s. So 1960s had a really strong market for the most part. There were additional socialized housing programs, significant investment in urban revitalization by the government, continuing from after World War II. So remember how I talked about everything was under rent control? This created slums. So 15 years later, we had to try to fix that because that was a problem. Whenever you do see the socialization of housing, especially on commercial buildings, you typically see a deterioration in condition because you can't invest as much as you'd like to because you're not getting the cash flow that you're expecting, right? So we had significant investment in urban revitalization. This was also a period of civil rights and a lot of collectivist thinking. So there were a lot of different acts passed, things like that. Eisenhower also signed the 1956 Federal Aid Highway Act. He was a soldier in Germany, I believe, or he was a soldier at a time, and he was in Germany, and he was watching the Autobahn system, and he just thought it was way superior to our current system. So when he became president, that was a major priority for him, is to get the highway systems built. And having the highway systems built out led to suburbs. It led to the building out of suburbs and people moving away from cities into suburbs, especially with automobiles and things like that. So this led into the 1970s, which is classified as the stagflation decade. A lot of people compare what we're currently going to the 1970s decade. However, there are some different things that happened. So in 1970s, the stagflation decade was high inflation driven by oil price shocks. Oil shocks as a result of conflict in the Middle East. So OPEC imposed oil embargoes on Israel supporting countries. That was October 1973 with the Yom Kippur War that Israel was involved in. Even with high rates though, speculation as an inflation hedge drove investment into real estate and into housing. We were taken off the gold standard in 1971. Housing prices went up. Burst in construction in the early 70s created too much supply that was eaten up by demand later in the half of the decade. 1979 oil shock was the Iran Revolution, and high housing prices raised due to inflation and investment as a hedge until the end of the decade when Volcker started raising rates rapidly. So Paul Volcker came in 1980s. I call this period the Paul Volcker period. So 1979, 1981, Paul Volcker comes in and he raises rates to combat this inflation because the whole decade, it's been a struggle. So 30-year fixed rate almost hits 20% back then. And this made the housing market dip, a lot, obviously. But at the same time they were doing this, they were also deregulating the credit sector, so the finance sector. And they were creating different tax reforms to try to counteract the high interest rates, right? Reagan was president at this time. So I point a couple of those acts out in this presentation. Rates are super high, 81. And we have the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981. So President Reagan signed this into law, and this is basically an accelerated cost recovery system or an accelerated depreciation system. I think you could take like a commercial property and say it's got 15 years depreciation, and then there was some bonus things on top of that. Definitely, if you're interested, read up on that. It's not a thing anymore, obviously, and we'll talk about that in a second. So we saw prices shoot up like crazy from 81 to 86 because you had all this development going on. You had all this investment into real estate because of the great tax things that were going on. You had amazing tax benefits. And then 1986, as soon as those tax benefits go away, so 1986 they took away those tax benefits, and you see real estate just plummet, right? So you have the rise of adjustable rate mortgages in the 1980s because of the deregulation of the finance industry, and you also have some tax reforms that make it super appealing to build real estate and invest in real estate, which are later taken away, which kills the market. So beginning of 80s, you're down. These new acts make you go up, and then by mid 80s, by 86, 87, you're down again, and it's a tough one at that period. As you can see here in this chart, you can see existing home sales drop to negative 20%, and prices really start to drop here as well. So after this time, under some other things, I guess I should just read this slide, because underwriting practices were also loosened in the 80s as banking competition increased. So when you see interest rates go up like this in the 80s, late 70s, 80s, you see banks really get squeezed, and they have to figure out how to attract more deposits, all that type of thing, right? So this led to like more competitive behavior in the banking sector, and there was also deregulation that was going on. And I also wanted to point out these acts, that like the Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980, which was a step in deregulating the finance sector, and then the Garn Street Germain Depository Institutions Act of 1982. So 1990 to now, so we got through the 80s, and this is a chart of the Fed's fund rate for the last, from 1955 to now. And as you can see here, we're certainly not in any type of interest rate environment that we haven't been in before. We've been much higher, and you can also see the recessions shaded in gray. So the late 80s, early 90s, we had the S&L crisis, the savings and loan crisis. 1,043 of the 3,234 savings and loan associations failed. 32% of all S&Ls went out of business. They're similar to a credit union, if you haven't heard of that before, and they're not as prevalent as today, but they were very prevalent back then, and their primary focus was to enhance homeownership. So a government agency called the Resolution Trust Company was formed to liquidate these assets after we had this major crash from the failed S&Ls, and it didn't finish until 1995. Across the decade, real estate prices generally saw a gradual increase. The pace of growth was moderate compared to the boom periods of the 1980s or the early 2000s, but was steady and sustainable, setting a solid foundation for the more dramatic increases in the years following the 1990s. So, we had this major hit in the beginning of the 90s. We see stabilization coming into the dot-com bubble. So the 2000s bubble was when all the internet companies went crazy and they weren't profitable and stuff like that. There was a lot of speculation going into the market then, and ultimately the market crashed. But this didn't affect real estate that much, as real estate was still recovering from its lows in the 90s S&L crisis. But that led us up into the 08 Great Financial Crisis. So we dropped rates because of the 2000 bubble, and that increased more and more credit expansion into real estate. So that leads us to 2007 to 8 period, which is the Great Financial Crisis. And I'm just going to touch on this for a second because a lot of you probably already know a lot about this. But the deregulation in the banking sector from the 80s to the 90s led to the start of subprime lending. So we talked about some of it in the last slide. There is a lot more, though, like some more acts that I didn't even touch on that allowed this to happen. And then they were taken away, obviously, with Dodd-Frank. At the same time, The rise of mortgage-backed securities were starting to grow as individuals such as Larry Fink, he owns BlackRock now, made it a more viable investment instrument by developing tools to better assess these securities. So he was able to analyze risk better. He developed these tools to do that. So the advancement of technology, again, we see that in the rise of credit, right? Everyone seeing this presentation should have a good understanding on the Great Financial Crisis, so I'm not going into it anymore. This leads us to now. So coming out of the Great Financial Crisis, rates were left at historical lows. We had a pandemic, etc. We face a lot of the same issues we have in the past. But I'm going to touch on the migration and immigration effects and what they have on housing, because throughout my whole study on this, not every market is the same. So real estate as a whole is broadly impacted by credit expansion and contraction. However, your market really matters. Here we see the U-Haul growth index, net migration, U-Haul one-way trucks in to these cities. So red is out and green is in, and you can kind of see like the one-way U-Haul trips and what markets have been growing. I like U-Haul data and van life data and all those different, it's not what this presentation is about. So individual markets can perform differently than the real estate market as a whole. However, the effects of credit expansion and contraction are broadly felt. Migration and population are a major contributing factor to housing production and demand. The areas with the biggest price gains also saw the biggest declines, typically in areas overbuilt or oversupplied during the massive rise in demand and the rise of credit, right? New immigration creates major demand for affordable housing, as people moving to this country are usually poor. They end up moving to less desirable markets for affordability reasons. Wow. Segregation typically happens as well because they go into the less desirable areas and wealthier people. So supply constraints also and increased migration is what causes prices to rise, really. So zoning laws, rent restrictions, all that type of stuff. Which brings us to more on this continued. This is the migration maps that we've seen. Or no, this is the immigration. This is immigration. So this is aliens from another country coming here, and this is like where a lot of them are located according to this chart. So throughout time, different reasons have brought different people to different places. Oftentimes the circumstances for a move included proximity to work and better quality of life by value compared to what they were earning. So, you know, it depends on their real wages and what they're able to afford and get for their dollar. So by living there, does their quality of life rise? Are they able to live a good life and enjoy the local amenities that an area has to offer? So a city's ability to invest in infrastructure and local amenities helps a market tremendously. When a city has a good balance sheet and they have money to invest, that's a good sign. And this is from the National Bureau of Economic Research. Households migrate in response to local real wages and consumption amenities. That is, characteristics of a locality that affects residents' happiness at a given real wage. And that's from the NBER. Technological advances also have a major impact on migration and demands for housing. For example, the emergence of the automobile and development of suburbs in response, or the invention of air conditioning that allowed for migration to the Sun Belt. So AC became really popular like 1950s to 80s, and that's when you start seeing people move south. Before that, nobody moved to the south. It's too hot. And now we have the introduction of remote work. So this is a presentation. If you scan that QR code, you can download this presentation for free to be able to fact check everything I just said, because you shouldn't just take information without fact checking it. So that is available for download right there. And I think there's some other tools on that site as well. I hope you got some value out of this presentation today. And I really had to shorten it up. When I was building this, I've really spent like a few years on this subject. I've been studying, I'm a nerd about that, and I really had to shorten it. So, you know, there's a lot that I could add, but hopefully you got some value out of what I showed.